Just for fun.
This is a casual one.
This is all for fun.
No, thank God for insight.
Thanks.
Thank God for our stuff. I'm shutting off my cell phone. It is exactly 3:30, and we're starting on time, which, is not such an academic thing to do, but this project started on time, and so we're going to be consistent with that. So, good afternoon. Thanks a lot for coming. I'm Peter Behrman, and at least until the reception, I'll serve as the MC for this event. For me and for the team of people who finished the data collection, archive building component of the Obama Presidency Oral History Project, this launch of the public-facing stage of our project makes an important transition and calls for a celebration. I'll have more to say about the project shortly, but before then I want to note that this event also allows us to celebrate Lee Bollinger. Everyone here knows that Lee's been a visionary president of Columbia for more than the past 2 decades. What might be less well known is that he's also been a visionary, consistent supporter of our oral history work here, and that without Lee, this project and many others that we've done at Insight and CCOHR simply could not have happened. Lee brought this project home to us. He served as the chair of our advisory board, and for all of his support, we're very grateful. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to ask him to say a few words of welcome at this time. Lee?
So thank you very much, Peter. So I'd like to say something about my shoes, my clothing. I have running shoes on, and this is not a 77-year-old retiring president deciding he wants to look hip, it's a 77-year-old retiring president who has a knee problem and is under treatment, and my running shoes feel the best of any shoes I can put on. So hence the dress. So I just have 3 quick things to say. The first thing is just how important it is to Columbia to have this relationship with the president. Universities are really about scholarship, new ideas, teaching, deadly serious about that. We're also weak in the knees around power, and when you have President Obama, one of the leading figures in this century and all time, and he wants to have this relationship on his oral history. It's an extraordinary connection and relationship, and of course, as a graduate, it means the world to the institution to have this. So both on the substance and on the connection personally to somebody who's an alum, it's extremely meaningful. The second thing I want to say is that you just couldn't pick a better person to sort of manage, oversee, imagine what this could be than Peter. So Peter's just a brilliant person, and he has an instinct to do things. He has an impulse, and of course that's highly dangerous in the academic world. Sort of the last thing you want is somebody who's really good at doing things, and Peter is that exceptional person. So handing it over to Peter, who could then imagine an oral history, not like any oral history that's ever been done. How do you connect it to issues, to ordinary people, to groups of people who were activists and not just the usual people who played the key roles, but the people who were affected by the roles, or tried to be affected. And to do this through a pandemic, hundreds, 470 or so on interviews, of which I'm proud to be one. It was just an amazing thing to undertake. And so for Columbia, that's significant again, but for this type of project, it really sets a new standard. And the last thing I'd say is how important it is to take this now and to make it, in a sense, what it was for me. I mean, I've just this little tiny role, interviewed by Peter. Going through the process really made me think about a lot of things I hadn't thought about before. Was an educational experience for me. That's just a tiny, tiny example. This whole thing will have magnificent potential for educating people in the country and around the world. So that is the next phase, and I'm sure it will be incredibly successful. Let me just recognize, I should have done this at the beginning, but Jonathan Levine, who's the chair of our board and been a colleague and friend for years now, and also a very close friend and counselor to the president, and helpful in every possible way with that connection. So thank you, Peter. Thank you to the advisory board. Thank you to all the people who participated in this. It really is a lovely, lovely day to celebrate and go from here. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. As Lee mentioned, the Obama Foundation has been a key partner for us. They are the partners that academics dream about. When we, not nightmares, just dreams. When we needed help, we asked them to help us, and they did. They helped us secure 4-hour interviews with President and Mrs. Obama. They helped us locate administration alumni. And critically, they helped us keep them beyond arm's length on every substantive issue. Every time we thought that it might be okay if we came close to the firewall we kept between us on intellectual grounds, it was the foundation that stepped back. So key to making this asymmetric collaboration succeed was the work of Chris Lydell Westerfeld, he's here, Corey Schulman, and also Valerie Jarrett, who, as everyone knows, served as the director of the Office of Public Engagement and senior advisor to President Obama, and who now serves as the chief executive officer of the Obama Foundation. As a testament to the support the foundation has given us, Valerie's come up to New York to spend time with us today, and so we took the opportunity to ask her to share some thoughts with us at this time. So I'll turn the floor over to her before we get to the main event.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that introduction and for your incredible work on this project. And good afternoon, everyone. It is such a delight for me to look around and see so many familiar faces who are here as we mark this really momentous occasion, the launch of President Obama's Oral History Project at Columbia University. It was the greatest honor of my life to serve all 8 years in his administration, the longest serving senior advisor in history, which I take great pride in. I can't imagine why anyone would have left a moment before the very end. So to have been there from January 20th to January 20th was extraordinary for me. And I am so delighted that this history project represents the many broad and diverse voices, both in the administration, but also, importantly, voices of the people who were impacted by the decisions that President Obama made. And they're all a part of the rich fabric of this oral history. And so as we embark on this journey of remembrance, I want to take a moment to acknowledge Lee Bollinger as well and his extraordinary 21-year tenure at Columbia. I asked him what was the average shelf life of a president, and he said about 7 or 8 years. So you have outdone yourself. But as Lee knows, my relationship with him goes back 4 decades, back to when I was a student at the University of Michigan Law School, and Lee was on the faculty. And I took a keen interest in observing his career as a proud alum over the decades, both his leadership at the University of Michigan, his willingness to stand firm on issues like affirmative action, and then his extraordinary tenure here at Columbia. So Lee, I want to say that you have demonstrated consistently an unwavering commitment to fostering intellectual discourse, free expression, open dialogue, embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging critical thinking, all of which have been instrumental in promoting the kind of culture of inclusivity and rigorous learning that Columbia is so well known for. And Lee and many of the other faculty here at Columbia have also been responsible for the tremendous body of rigorous research done around ways in which we can strengthen our democracies. And that's one of the reasons why President Obama chose to hold our first ever initial inaugural Democracy Forum right here in New York, co-hosted by Columbia last fall, and we'll be having another one this year, because we understand that we have to collectively and individually tackle the issues that are taking away from the fabric of our democracy. So Lee, thank you. One more round of applause. We can't applaud enough. So in addition to our admiration for Lee and the fact that President Obama is an alum, one of the reasons why he wanted to have his official oral history overseen by Columbia is because Columbia has an extraordinary, prestigious, and one of the largest oral history archives in the world, not in this country, but in the world. And the Obama Oral History Project is a testament, I believe, to the enduring legacy of President Obama, who captivated the nation and the world in his vision of hope and change. Through in-depth interviews and personal accounts, this project uniquely captures a wide and diverse range of perspectives, offering invaluable insight into the transformative movements, accomplishments, and challenges of President Obama's presidency. This initiative goes beyond mere recollections. It seeks to eliminate the significance of those years and the impact that they had on our nation and the world. And by preserving these narratives, we ensure that future generations have access to the lived experiences and lessons learned. But ultimately, these interviews will serve an important record for both historians and scholars to not just learn, but to learn with an act towards the future. What can we do to prepare the next generation of young leaders? And we also believe that young folks around the world will hear these stories, and they will see people who look like them telling the stories. And our hope in so doing, that will motivate them to go out and be those mighty agents for change back home in their own communities. So that's why we're so terribly excited. And the final point I would make is that when the Obama Center is finished, and it is well under construction now, if anybody gets to Chicago, just call us up. We'd love to give you a tour of it. But these important oral history archives will also be housed there. And the hope, again, is that every visitor to our center will take a little bit of this magic of our 8 years and bring it close to their heart and help it go forth and change the world. So, Peter, I do want to thank you. Where'd you go, Peter? Peter's over there. Lost him. Your leadership and that of the incredible team here has given a gift not just to President Obama and to our foundation, but to this country and to the world. And your discipline, your rigor, your humor, your resilience, you're willing to put up with us, and your willingness to also abide by the fact that we wanted this to have integrity of its own and to stand up to all the academic scrutiny that it deserves. And so I want to thank you for being the champion of that effort. So with that, I really want to just say it's an honor for me to be here. I'm glad to see all of you here. I hope you'll go out and tell your friends and your colleagues to dig in. We will be rolling this out over time, and focusing on climate today is really important. And I'm so glad to see members of our administration who know a keen amount about the topic here, because it's one of the largest threats and concerns and was one of the biggest priorities for President Obama. And he's really proud of his tenure as a steward for our planet. So again, thank you very much, everybody.
I was going to give a speech, but Valerie gave it, so thank you so much. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge Jonathan Levine, who's the outgoing chair of the Columbia Board of Trustees, who, as Lee said, has been a great friend of the Obamas, but for us, importantly, of Columbia, and has done so much to build the many programs and projects reflecting and building on the Obama legacy here at Columbia. So, Jonathan, thanks so much. So let me say a few words about the order of events for the day. I'll make a few comments about the project. We'll have a panel discussion on climate and the environment. Ken Mack, one of our board members, will moderate the conversation, which will open up for a few questions from you, using the microphones there on each end, if you would, before a reception where I hope you'll be able to meet each other, meet friends of the project, meet administration, alumni, and also the team that pulled this project off. So now for the first few comments on the project. Studies of the presidency can be small, insular affairs. If they are, the implicit theory behind their design is that what mattered was what a small group of insiders did. This was a different presidential oral history project with a different theory. Even if that's true, we did record hundreds of hours with people who put us in rooms where decisions of enormous importance were made, but the central idea was different. The theory that guided us reflected what we believe was a key aspiration of the Obama presidency, which was to connect with and be informed by the experiences of everyday people. Oral history projects of this scale often can take years and years, and sometimes even decades to complete. This project was different because it was finished quickly with video and audio capture at a really high level of intellectual engagement. So that's another difference. From the start, as Valerie indicated, we've had in mind the projection of this work onto the world. We hope that the archives of memories, thoughts, and insights we built will shape historical understandings for years to come, which is the aim of most presidential oral histories. But we also hope that it will shape action in the years to come, because the design, talking to ordinary people who turned themselves into activists, and activists like President Obama, who turned themselves into actors with the grasp of the handles of power, has created an archive of models for people who want to make a positive difference inside and outside of the halls of power. So one of the things we were also hoping is that, lots of kids, lots of teachers, lots of elementary school teachers, lots of parents will engage with the materials, think about them, and maybe have their lives changed a little bit. Some demographics. We completed interviews with 470 people, often held over multiple sessions with more than 1,100 hours of audio and video recordings. In addition to interviews with hundreds of ordinary people, artists, activists, NGO leaders, and yes, Republicans and Republican leaders, we also have a unique focus on the East Wing and special subfoci on President Obama's roots in Hawaii and in Chicago. And we did that during an exceptionally difficult time for our country and the world. You might remember that the last 3 years we've been in the midst of a global pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, the murders of George Floyd and others, a bitter and polarized election cycle, the January 6th assault on our democracy, and actually, there's really no stopping me. I could just go on and on. None of that would have been possible without the work of 4 scholars, Terrell Fraser, Dov Weinrib-Grosgall, Nikki Hemmer, and Evan McCormick, who together interviewed 298 people. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Liz Strong managed the project from start to finish. Mary Marshall Clark, director of the Columbia Center for Oral History Research, and Kimberly Springer, director of the Columbia Oral History Archives, from where these materials will be sent, also played critical roles, as did Michael Falco, the executive director of Insight. There are dozens and dozens of others that I don't have time to name. Administrators at Columbia, Insight and CCOHR, staff, students, interviewers, and our board of advisors. Today, we're really pleased that Karita Brown, Alondra Nelson, Jennifer Lee, Ken Mack, and Doug Brinkley are here with us, and there were 6 or 7 other board members. All of them made it possible to wrap up this complex project in less than 4 years. So I don't want to turn this into an Oscar speech, but we are super grateful for your help. We couldn't have done it without you. Today's panel is metonymic of the project, reflecting key aspects of the design, which was motivated first by an urge to decenter the experience of the president and center the study around the experiences and interactions of people both inside and outside of the administration, and thereby concentrate on the dialogical relationship between those who had power and those who experienced it, influenced that power, and tried to transform it. That was our first goal. The second goal was to reflect an idea central to our vision at Columbia of oral history, that, and here I'll quote R.D. Laing, that, quote, "It's better to travel through a single land with 1,000 pair of eyes than 1,000 lands with a single pair of eyes." For every topic, for every issue, we've interviewed narrators from multiple standpoints, reflecting their different walks of life, their understandings and views intersecting, crossing in some instances aligning, and in others not. Today's panel is on climate and the environment. It's one of more than 40 issue domains we focused on. Alongside our panel conversation, we're also releasing 17 transcripts related to this area. They include people joining us here this afternoon, Todd Stern and Francis Beinecke, but also others who played important roles. Administration figures like Stephen Chu and Carol Browner, activists, artists, and farmers, Joe Del Bosque, for example, but also Art and Helen Tandrup, who joined the self-identified Cowboy and Indian Alliance that challenged the Keystone XL pipeline extension in order to be faithful stewards of their Nebraska farmland, not environmental activists. Here's a picture of here's an image of the world's largest crop installation that the Tandrups plowed into their land to attract attention to the struggle to stop the pipeline. And here's a picture of Joe Del Bosque, a melon farmer in California whose crops are threatened by drought, here meeting with President Obama before the president gave a speech on climate change at Del Bosque's farm. To give a sense of the ways in which we achieve what we've, to give a sense of the way in which the archive we've built works, 9 of the 17 narrators who talk about climate speak about Keystone. Many also speak about deep water, food and food security, energy, and of course, climate and and international climate negotiations like the Paris Agreement. And so for climate and for every major issue or policy domain, both global and domestic, the archive puts into conversation individuals whose stories cross over, intersect one another from multiple standpoints. We picked climate as our first topic to reflect Columbia's commitment to climate and climate action, a commitment that led Lee Bollinger to build a climate school here alongside and at par with our other schools. But as Valerie says, we also picked it to reflect President Obama's insistence that climate change and the environment was a challenge to and related to national security, economic growth, and social justice. In case there's any doubt, it still is. The panel and our launch today serves to index an end, but it's also a beginning. It indexes the end of our data collection and the beginning of a series of similar events on race, the financial crisis and economic recovery, healthcare, science and science policy, global change, and the East Wing, among others. So what we would like to be sure of is that you stay in touch so you don't miss any updates on these events, which we hope will be held around the country. Those are my comments on the study as a whole. Now it's time to move on to the main attraction, our panel. We're fortunate to have Ken Mack serve as the moderator. Ken is the Lawrence D. Beale Professor of Law and affiliate professor of history at Harvard. And in addition to serving on our advisory board, he also conducted 3 interviews for the project. Joining Ken will be Francis Beinecke, a leading environmentalist who was at NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, for more than 4 decades and was president of the NRDC throughout the years that President Obama was in office. She recorded her oral history for this project, and her interview is among the 17 that was released today, and you can see on our webpage. Doug Brinkley. Doug is an environmental and presidential historian and the Catherine Sanoff Brown Chair in the Humanities at Rice University. Doug also served on our advisory board and conducted 2 interviews for the project about environmental policy. Shayla Murray. Shayla is currently the Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Columbia. Before then, she shaped communication strategy inside the Obama White House, most recently serving as senior advisor to President Obama from 2015 to 2017. Previously, she was then Vice President Biden's Deputy Chief of Staff and Communications Director. And Shayla recorded an interview with us, which will be released at a later date. And finally, on the panel is Todd Stern, who in his role as U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change was President Obama's chief climate negotiator for all 8 years of the presidency. Todd recorded his oral history with us over 2 sessions, and like Francis, his interview is also available online as we speak at obamaoralhistory.columbia.edu. So thanks so much for participating in today's event, and now I'll turn it over to Ken and the rest of the panel. So if you guys step up, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you to Todd. Thank you to the Columbia University Oral History Project for inviting us to be on this panel. It's a historic occasion. I might start with something from President Obama. President Obama always says that change comes from within and without. Both people inside presidential administrations and people outside, and our panel today represents that very well. Our topic today is going to be climate. Every day we find news about climate change, both policies of the present administration and news about what's happening in the wider world. Today we find that one of the major insurers will stop offering homeowners insurance in the entire state of California because of the threat of wildfires. This is an issue that's with us every day. I think what the Oral History Project might represent is an ability to grapple with a particular period, a crucial period in our history from a variety of perspectives. So I'm going to, structure this as a conversation today among all of you. I'm going to throw out some fairly general questions and ask all of you to reflect on them. And I think we're going to proceed more or less chronologically, more or less from the beginning of the administration through some of the highlights to some of the later events. So I'd really like to start just at the beginning. And for our purposes, the beginning will be the Obama campaign for the presidency, ultimately successful. And I think I'd like to really start with Francis from the perspective, and any of you who want to sort of offer thoughts on this, feel free to jump in. From the perspective of the advocacy community, what did candidate Obama promise in 2007 and 2008, and what did one expect of him realistically at the beginning of 2009 when his presidency began? Francis, if you could
Well, just
start.
to reflect on it for a minute, we, the environmental community, were determined that the candidate on the Democratic side and the Republican side, if it could have happened, had to have climate as a priority. So we pushed very hard during the campaign to raise the climate issue. And we raised it during the primaries, and then when he was the candidate, we raised it during that period. We also worked on the platform, on the Democratic platform, making sure that climate was a main feature of the platform. So as the campaign went on, I won't say that climate got the kind of attention we would have liked, but it did get attention, and he was clearly committed to it. He was committed to it in his speeches, and he was committed to it on the day of the inauguration. It was in the inaugural speech, and climate is an issue that many of us have worked on for decades. We worked on it throughout the Clinton administration. We didn't get to where we wanted to go. We clearly didn't get there at all during the Bush administration. So hope was primary for us. And getting a commitment and making it part of the platform and ensuring that Obama coming in as the president made it a priority was very important, and we felt we had achieved that, and that he had taken it as a priority. And he demonstrated that in his inaugural speech by stating his commitment to it.
I might make one comment, Ken. In the international community, there was just enormous hope and excitement that was generated by President Obama coming in. The world was in the middle of a 2-year negotiation that had started in 2007, was supposed to end in 2009 in Copenhagen. There were, as I say, tremendous hope associated with President Obama, which was fundamentally great, although in some ways, given the issues it had to be tangled with, also challenging in the sense that many other countries who saw who conceived of a certain kind of agreement, which wasn't actually going to be possible, thought, well, of course it'll be possible because we have Obama there, like anything can happen. And President Obama was enormously important all the way through, and actually all the way through to Copenhagen. But the hope that came with it was really very much noticeable.
Well, first off, Columbia University, it's such an honor to be here because I think out of any university, Columbia has done more about climate action than any higher education institute. You're leading the charge, and so it's fitting we're starting with climate, and that Barack Obama went to this school. It's his alma mater, and having Valerie here and the rest, it's all very meaningful. I would look at Barack Obama 2008 from the lens that he's got to win the presidency, and he's got to win the presidency with the Great Recession ripping our country apart. I mean, we're dealing with a crisis that we should never minimize. I see it sometimes, recession's not a depression, or maybe young people that weren't alive that we're going to be teaching in our universities don't remember how bad the Great Recession was. So it was a bit of yet Obama kept the faith on climate in the campaign. He prioritized it. He talked about it, the fact that he had his BlackBerry, and he was going to be part of a new generation that got new things. Now that we know we got out of that recession, it fades, but at the time it was a panic situation, and we were stuck in Iraq, George W. Bush's war, Barack Obama early on. And early as he was running for president, talking about getting out of Iraq or the problems with Iraq policy. And so lo and behold, when he got in and started prioritizing climate, it was a bit of a miracle that he did because, when you're in the middle of an economic meltdown and a recession, to keep the idea of climate change alive in the public sphere was a challenge. I mean, he had things like having to bail out General Motors. Well, this wasn't the GM doing green cars at that moment. They were still, it's about bailing out a Detroit automaker, that was using fossil fuels. When an economy goes southward, like ours was, and you're rising near 10% unemployment, jobs are the thing. Well, you can promise clean jobs, but that seems to be in the future when you need jobs now. So I felt President Obama, and I write about presidents and environmental marks in history, and the first president who grappled with climate was John F. Kennedy, when he was given at least a memo about the threat of global warming. We can see Lyndon Johnson addressed it all and like shot a flare up in the air and it disappeared. There's a dramatic memo that Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote to John Ehrlichman in the Nixon White House, where Moynihan's saying, I'm talking to the weather scientists and the top people in our country, and they're saying that if this, we might be saying goodbye to Miami and goodbye to New York. That's Moynihan, to the chief domestic advisor for Nixon. Jimmy Carter dealt with climate. We almost had the big Al Gore moment. Inconvenient truth, it didn't happen. There wasn't a wave. So Obama was coming in with a difficult situation to make climate the top issue, and he tried right out of the gate. But he also had the Affordable Care Act and wanting to deal with that and all these other issues, and then started getting Tea Party backlash. And Republicans, who, let's just say circa 2003, there's still 10 Republican senators talking climate. They were dwindling. By the time of the Affordable Care Act, when Mitch McConnell said, we're not doing business with the Obama administration, it allowed Obama to be in a precarious situation of having to explain climate, the climate crisis, also engage in international conferences, being a leader at the UN and Copenhagen, Paris, and the rest, and find ways to make tangibly explain to the American public, well, we have to turn to a green economy. And I think he wanted to do a bigger grid out of the gate. I used to equate it to the Eisenhower interstate highway system, a kind of Obama alternative energy grid early on. The politics of that were difficult, but the fact that President Obama throughout 8 years continued to elevate climate as an issue, and the very fact we're here today elevating it as the first opening of a massive oral history project, the largest on a president ever, and we are opening with climate change. And that's a reflection of Barack and Michelle Obama, Valerie Jarrett, and others' commitment to this as being a really an important issue. And last thing, we could look at how this reflected tangible things you could do in the United States on land water conservation. When you write about EPA, let me just say this, you write about EPA history. William Ruckelshaus, to me, is the epitome of a great EPA head. But Gina McCarthy's unbelievable force of nature on air emissions, water quality, the work she did in Northeast, and continuing to do for our country as a Paul Revere figure, warning about the climate chaos to come and coming up with practical solutions. The very fact that Obama picked somebody like her to run EPA was powerful. I would say only with Ruckelshaus. In my mind, she's one of the two key great EPA administrators. And then you get into the interior realm with Ken Salazar and Sally Jewell, and the fact that Obama created 25 national monuments and ended up saving, 500, something like, 500 million acres of land in the 21st century, and water with Hawaii, but marine, and showed he was keeping the old Theodore Roosevelt flame alive of land, water, parks, recreation, urban recreation, because he knew he had to continue to educate the people about what there was to save, whether it's a coral reef or a herd of big shorthorn sheep or, the great caribou herds of Alaska. He was on the job all the time and thinking and prioritizing climate. Frustrations, yes, but the will that he had to kind of elevate this is epic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Two very quick comments. In the light of the Great Recession, when the president came in, he actually went right out of the blocks to do things on climate. The first was there needed to be a big bailout package. I think it was around $800 million and $800 billion, and $90 billion of that was devoted to stimulus that would be climate related and clean energy related. The second thing was, as Doug talked about, there was the auto bailout. The auto bailout came with a price for the auto companies, which is that they agreed to a major increase in the miles per gallon that so-called CAFE standards, which hadn't changed for many years and basically went up by 2 times, I think, in the course of over the period that he acted. So those were really big, and they got through one house, not the other house, but a big legislative piece, broad piece for the whole economy. So even with all of that, he came out swinging on climate.
And yet, so I covered Obama as a political reporter. I covered his campaign in 2008. I wrote the story for the Washington Post when he announced his campaign. So if you saw this from the outside, I think there were just such enormous expectations that he confronted across the board in all policy categories. He had assumed this heroic status pretty much the day he won the Iowa caucus. And I think climate is a really good example. There are a lot of breadcrumbs in the early years of the first 2 years of the administration, but especially related to climate, where he did pivot to, he confronted this enormous recession on his way in, pivoted to the Recovery Act and plowed a lot of really consequential policy through that bill that now is in phase 2 or 3, as we've seen in the last few years coming out of the Biden administration, and yet was still measured against that early promise and those really unreasonable expectations right out of the gate. And as someone who really tried for the entire 6 years I was there to find different ways of telling this climate story, of engaging reporters, of pulling people into the ring with us on the policy battles, it was unbelievably difficult. And I think it was partly because it was only at the end that we really caught up with reality, that the coverage started to reflect the reality of what he had done over those 8 years. And I think that's partly because the expectations coming in were so astronomical, and that it was just very difficult to realize them in the incremental way that we were forced to operate starting from day one because of the recession.
Can I just comment on that? Because yes, our expectations were very high. They still are very high because it's a huge global challenge and we have to rise to it. But also, just as he was advancing the climate agenda in the avenues that he could, he was also continuing the all of the above energy strategy, which incorporated a lot of oil and gas leasing and drilling across the country. We became a major energy exporter during the time, the energy independent. We became energy independent, and it wasn't because of clean energy and renewables, it was because of fossil fuels, and that created tremendous consternation within the community that was working hard to advance the climate strategy. So, on the one hand, we were and went to many meetings in the White House working closely to advance the climate agenda, and at the same time, we'd go to meetings in the old EOB to fight about the next next set of leases that were coming out. So, the environmental community had sort of a 2-part strategy. The affirmative, we've got to get this climate thing going, and you got to leave it in the ground. And both of those things were happening at the same time, and they're still happening. I mean, today with the Mountain Valley Pipeline in West Virginia, those fights continue to go on. And even as we pivot more and more and more to a clean energy strategy, we're not there yet. And we're still dependent on fossil fuels, and it creates, a tremendous amount of pressure.
One often engages in the thought exercise in the White House, I'm sure Valerie had many experiences like this, of imagining what it would be like if there was nothing but silence on the outside, right? Like, what would you actually accomplish if you had a completely open playing field? And I think climate is a really interesting territory to engage in that thought exercise, because energy is, most people see energy and climate as, distinct issues, and it's certainly the way that politics has. If you look at the 2010 midterm election, we got a very clear verdict on how the country is perfect. People are perfectly capable of holding both those ideas in their heads at the same time. They don't want to pay higher gas prices, but they also don't want their houses slipping into the ocean. So I think it's a good example of how just the imperfect set of options that meet you every single morning when you show up to work in that
Exactly right.
wonderful place we call home.
Sure, we're going to come back to you again, Shale, about the kind of both outsider and insider perspective,
Yeah.
because you're both a journalist and you worked in the White House. But I want to move forward to pick up on something you just said about voices on the outside. So there was a disappointment that cap and trade passes the House but doesn't get through the Senate, and there's been some criticism of the administration or President Obama perhaps is not pushing as hard as he should have. At least some people say this. But I want to move forward to move back actually to climate policy again. And one of the big events, of course, is something called the Conference of the Parties, the Copenhagen Conference at the end of 2009, that of course sets the stage in the longer term for the Paris Accord of 2015. And again, this is kind of a question for Todd, but really a question for the entire panel. What was the Conference of the Parties, and what's the interplay between the inside and the outside? What are people who are outside, not directly involved in those negotiations, thinking, writing? What's the significance of this moment?
So I'll let Francis do the outside. I'll give you a little perspective from the inside. And so the Conference of the Parties, otherwise known as the COP, there's one of these every year. That's the way that the climate negotiations are organized. And Copenhagen was supposed to be the end of that 2-year period that I referred to earlier, that was in the hopes of people all over the world going to deliver the big unified field theory of dealing with climate change. And as I said, there was just tremendous hope surrounding President Obama. And when we came in, we knew. I mean, I'd been through this before. I was in the Clinton White House. Had got pulled into climate change back before the Kyoto conference, so I sort of had some experience. The paradigm of a climate agreement that most people around the world were dreaming of was not something that could, in that form, get done. And it certainly could not have gotten done with the United States as part of it. So the last thing that we wanted to do was a repeat of what happened in Kyoto, which was we agreed to the agreement, and then it couldn't get, it didn't even get sent to the Senate because there was not even a ghost of a chance of getting it passed. So that was kind of the context, and through the course of the year, with a lot of initiative by the Danes, who get frequently pilloried for their handling of Kyoto, and they did of Copenhagen, and they did make some mistakes, but they did some very smart things, which was they were bound and determined to find a way that the biggest players, U.S., EU, China, could agree on something that could get us started, even if it wasn't going to be the thing that we needed to get done. And that was our orientation. And President Obama, as I said, I won't. There's limited time. I'll go into it more if you want me to, but I will. But there was an incredible sort of last 24 hours, and presidents and leaders all around the world had been invited to come to the Copenhagen COP. First time that had ever happened. Because the Danes thought that the thing we were trying to get done could never get done because it was such a big change from expectations without leaders there. The negotiators wouldn't have had the nerve to do it. And it didn't look like it was going to get done until President Obama got there and really helped get it over the line. So he played a huge role. To this day, the Copenhagen COP is regarded by most people as a miserable failure. It was in fact miserably chaotic, but it planted the seeds that ultimately bore fruit in Paris and in the view of those of us in the U.S., and I include Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was there, and the president, and people I worked with. We were quite convinced that something very important had happened, even though it was unpopular.
Other perspectives?
Well, exactly about Copenhagen, but I think what President Obama, he had won the Nobel Prize, right? And when on the world stage, he was our first global president. He was loved all over the world. Ken and I would see him as a group of historians periodically in the White House. But my takeaways from those on the issue of climate with him was his frustration of how do you sell climate crisis to the American public? How he was frustrated. Is it a movie? Is it a photo op? I mean, he was even laughing. Do I go for what? I photograph myself with the melting glacier behind me. We're living in an age of yeah, right. But and he went to that famous Alaska trip. But he was hungering for that. How do I educate the American public? It's 50 years ago was the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Do you know what that passed the Senate by? 92-0. So you had a consensus on some kind of environmental action. What I'm suggesting is in the United States, he was getting blowback and in a very difficult political atmosphere where you started getting the birth of the climate hoax that the right started, perpetrating in the late Obama years. But I think given that we're here today, no president had tried to and has elevated. I think we're talking so much about climate. There are climate action, climate institutes opening, I think because President Obama's efforts to open up the consciousness of it. If he couldn't get to the Republican parties, he'd get to young people and to grassroots activists. And I don't think there was a real environmental movement when he became president due to the recession in Iraq. A lot of energy was on other things, but by the end of it, he had deep respect for people like Bill McKibben. And read him, even though he doesn't agree with them on everything, but he was a grassroots activist, Barack Obama, and he understands. At least, I even recall him saying, at least he's trying to find a way to get this in the public sphere to be talked about.
Can I just go back to that early, or the fall of 2009? So, the Affordable Care Act passed while it was getting negotiated. We were begging for action on the Waxman-Markey bill in the House. That passed. We were elated. I remember a call with Speaker Pelosi with the environmental leaders where she said, you better go out and defend these people who voted for this bill because this was a very tough vote, won by a small margin. And then those people lost in the 2010 election. We weren't able to get it through the Senate, even with the White House's support, which I think was a result of a lot of things. One was the financial meltdown. We couldn't get those votes in the Midwest. They had lost so many jobs. The promise of green jobs just wasn't a real promise. We talked about it, but we couldn't demonstrate it. And we actually didn't have a political ground game. And that's to Doug's point. We were a lot of climate experts, a lot of policy experts. We worked hard on the policy, but we didn't have a ground game. And when we weren't able to get that bill through the Senate, and then going to Copenhagen, there was a question, which we thought there was a question about, is the president going to go? Because he doesn't have anything to show. We didn't get legislation. He he has the promise of working on it, but not actually the goods to show. And at that point, the environmental community was like, we have to create a political game here. Without that, if you can't get it past the legislature, the Congress, we're dead. So to to Doug's point, there was a huge shift in 2009, 2010 to grow a political arm that we just didn't have at that time. And it's much stronger now, and there's a much stronger grassroots. And if we talk about Keystone, we could talk about how that emerged too.
And with Keystone, I mean, it's a 7-year review. The president is torn over the Keystone pipeline for all the energy versus environment. But in the end, as an environmentalist, I felt he did the right thing. And I think he got a lot of believers on Keystone, you know, just to disallow and listen on the ground to people in the Great Plains, to not green light a 1,179 miles pipeline from, you know, Canada to the Texas coast, to say no to that. That took a lot of political capital and political courage. True, it's a second term and you're not worrying about re-election, but when I look at the capitulation, and I'm all for the Biden-McCarthy deal, don't get me wrong, but the West Virginia sticks in my craw a little bit, the pipeline this late of the day going on, and also the Willow Project up in Alaska. I do not believe on either of those that Barack Obama would have made that concession this late in the game. But I might be saying that only because I'm thinking of second-term Obama when the Keystone Pipeline, you know, hit the fan.
One thing the Keystone Pipeline did, so it was already there when he was elected president. Is it going to be approved? And it had to be approved by the State Department. Is it in the national interest? And it, you know, first they were for it, and then they were postponing, and then finally in 2015, he turned it down. What that actually resulted in was a growing grassroots. More, and I mean, it started out ranchers, farmers along the pipeline. You know, this is our aquifer. We don't want this going past us. It became grassroots. It became very engaged with young people across the country. It was a rallying cry. And I'll just say, the national environmental community, they didn't pick Keystone. We were focused on tar sands in the Boreal in Canada. We were focused on Keystone. Suddenly Keystone is catching fire. And one thing I learned from that, I was like, you don't know what's going to catch fire. Yeah. You really don't know what issue is going to grab the American public, and then all of a sudden everybody is on it. But what we were able to bring to the table was, you know, we had a big communications department, a megaphone, a membership, so we could take that grassroots energy and help amplify it. But the leadership was coming from the grassroots, and the longer it took, the stronger the grassroots became. And I think that's an essential part of advancing the climate agenda. So that isn't something that the national groups sort of thought out strategically. That just emerged, and to the benefit of advancing the agenda overall. It's very interesting.
Yeah, one thing I would simply say that I think applies to all of these different episodes is that, you know, the president is often characterized, I think this will really come through in these interviews, he's often characterized as being kind of politically unsophisticated. But in fact, I think it was almost the opposite, where he was so attuned to the complex way that individuals went about their lives and made personal decisions for themselves and their families and their communities, that it was, when you were looking at whether it was, I mean, I can't remember who raised this, but like, what is a green job, and how does it make a difference in a community? I mean, when I was working for Vice President Biden, we went to 300 community colleges that had partnerships with local industries, you know, I mean, not 300, but thereabouts, that were retraining auto workers and people from all kinds of industries that were dying from the recession in these new green technologies. There were just endless little stories that we were trying to develop in communities to make that connection with people so that they would see it as you know, something that was material and beneficial to them. And the Alaska trip was, you know, what was the difference with the Alaska trip? Well, we took along this celebrity named Bear Grylls, right? And I was on this trip, I planned this trip. It was all about kind of bringing climate change into people's living rooms during prime time with a celebrity who they thought was cool, and came at it more from kind of an adventure outdoors perspective. We knew that the one thing people cared about universally across party lines was the outdoors, right? And conservation and lots of Republican bird watchers and so on and so forth. But we were, by the end, we were extremely meticulous in how we bore into these issues, because we had the benefit of years of understanding how complex people receive, how difficult it was to deliver the information absent the complexity that I think reflects the way people actually see it. So, whether it was scuba diving with National Geographic, Midway Island, oh my gosh, the president's scuba diving, but that was also brought attention to the oceans issues that we were trying to surface and we're developing policy around. So it's a frustrating issue from a communications perspective, because you have these really well-funded camps on either side, and there is just no benefit to being in the middle on these issues, right? There's no constituency for it, except for everybody, right? Except for all the regular people. But you got to go through their TVs at prime time, apparently, to reach them. It's tough.
Yeah, and remember that's Sarah Palin's Drill Baby Drill,
Yeah.
and he ran. That was the opposition. He was when you go to Alaska, it's a red state with senators that are beholden to the oil and gas world and extraction industries, and Obama's going up there visiting with Gwich'in peoples or having funny moments with fish, kissing a fish or but it was just to try to keep reminding people about the natural world and what is to be saved. And we had good people in government then, like John Podesta, who really knew about climate. I mean, truly does, John, and wilderness.
And was political.
And political. Helped. And Harry Reid, pushing some big projects in Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, National Monument, and all the rest. I mean, so it was there were people in the party that got it and were fighting with on this climate issue, but elevating it. This last midterm election, if you look at climate, Democrats did pretty well, but climate's like 5th, 6th.
Amazing.
On the concerns. Well, Obama was trying to elevate it to top concern,
Yeah.
and we're 1 or 2, and I wish we were doing that now.
Yeah, a big factor in this is just the demise not only of Western Democrats, but also Western Republicans who, there used to be a real constituency of Western senators in particular who were kind of the common ground focal points, especially, prior to the Obama years. So the infrastructure, the political infrastructure he was trying to work on was new. It was demolished in 2010, really. And so, tough backdrop.
Yeah, we've talked about several things, that in which the climate, the context for climate change and other environmental policy changes, communications, politics, all that's changing. I want to highlight just something in particular. President Obama makes a famous speech at Georgetown University early in his second term, where he criticizes Congress for having failed to act and pledges that he's going to act administratively, which basically is sort of was a consistent theme for the rest of his administration, and was carried over to the Biden administration. Did President Obama shift in his attention, approach, or strategy on this issue from the first term to the second, or do you see more consistency?
Yeah, so I think that there was, as we've already talked about, quite a lot of focus when he came in. There were the two issues that related to the financial crisis that I talked about. There was the effort to get the big so-called cap and trade bill done. Ultimately, that failed. I think probably in year 3 and 4 of the administration, I would say probably less focus coming from the White House. I think then that when the president got elected and was coming in for his second term, I think he was coming in seeing climate change as a very important piece of unfinished business, and he came in hot right away. He talked about climate change in the inaugural, which was you usually don't talk about policy issues in the inaugural address. He hit it hard in the State of the Union. Then he had the Georgetown speech, which was his most important climate speech, I think in June of 2013, where he laid out a whole clean climate action plan. Ended up including the big clean power plan as the centerpiece of it. So yeah, I think that came in big, went down a little bit because there wasn't much more you could do at that point, and then came in ready to really hit it hard. And he played a huge international role. I mean, there was probably no single event. Lots of things contributed to the Paris Climate Accord, but the kind of amazing agreement, and more amazing because there was a 9-month completely secret negotiation that we conducted with the Chinese after proposing this idea to them, to have the two presidents walk down the aisle together in the Great Hall of the People in November of 2014, announcing what their targets were going to be, and saying that we together are going to get this done. That was just stunning to the world, complete shock to everybody. The press had no inkling. It was on the front pages of every paper. And as I then continued, to do my diplomatic work in 2015, over and over I would hear from countries who had been sort of the most antagonistic and the most difficult to deal with, we have confidence now because China and the United States have come together, President Obama and President Xi, we think we're going to get this done. And so that was a huge contribution. He did a bunch of things during the course of 2015, but that was just a huge contribution to ultimately getting Paris done.
And I think in addition to all this, I think the president had an understanding of how climate issues will affect the poor and underserved communities in the long haul. This is a period where people like John Lewis was still talking about environmental justice issues and leading on Capitol Hill. I see President Obama not wanting to get flummoxed on the environment and adopting a Theodore Roosevelt posture, which I mentioned, in the sense of I can sign executive orders to do some things on marine areas, on Maine woods, on San Juan Islands, and then are there different ways to be beyond looking for a new, cleaner energy? Can you administer land in a different way? I'm thinking of Bears Ear, where you're looking at public lands that would be administered by 5 tribes instead of just being, dictated to from Washington, D.C. You would let a new way of running a national monument in Bears Ear, Utah, which was innovative. And at the same time, he was doing heritage expansion of the National Park Service and educating people on other stories. When he saved Cesar Chavez's place in Tehachapi, Keene, California, as a national monument, I mean, Chavez cut his chops on beyond the farm workers, but on pesticides and the lack of Michelle Obama's doing organic farm, talking about organic produce, while they're saving Cesar Chavez, who went against the use of pesticides that hurt agricultural farm workers. I'm just suggesting there's an intellectual ferment going on in a lot of ways of thinking about how we can be 21st century land and water stewards in a main way. Climate's the centerpiece of it, but he was attacking it from a lot of different angles, even why we have to protect bees for being pollinated. Well, that gave Fox News a year to mock him about bees, but he was right about bees, or, he's right about these issues that he was taking on, but it started falling into the cultural war, unfortunately, and we haven't yet been able to really form a consensus on wanting to be the world leader as a federal government, although we're all seeing it happening in states like California and Oregon. You're going to ban fossil fuel vehicles being sold by 2030. And so I'm starting to see the state action happening a lot, California, Oregon, Washington, which is it may spread because that gridlock there that we're all living with doesn't make it a time for the 92-0 vote on endangered species.
One thing that I think happened during the Obama period was just a much greater awareness on the part of the American public of what the consequences of our oil addiction was. And part of that was fracking. I mean, we haven't talked about fracking, but fracking exploded during that period. And suddenly, the fracking was happening all over the country, and whereas oil and gas leasing had always been relegated to it's the Gulf of Mexico, it's Texas, it's Wyoming, it's Alaska, and the rest of us don't know where our power comes from, and we're fine with that. Suddenly, drilling is going on all over the place, and something like 1 of every 20 Americans was close to a drill site. And these were in people's communities, next to their schools, next to their homes. So there was no longer out of sight, out of mind. Suddenly people were faced with, I went out to Western Pennsylvania, even people who had generationally worked in the oil and gas industry were opposing what was happening in their communities. And I think that created room to advance a green agenda because people didn't want that in their communities. They didn't want their rural communities to suddenly be industrialized, which is exactly what was happening. So, there was, a lot was happening at that time. There was a growing awareness, not only about the climate threat, but of the implications of the oil addiction and how that affected them personally. And, after we were defeated on getting the legislation and came back looking at what could be done administratively, we were actually framing it in a health frame, not in this is a climate strategy, but this is to stop asthma and air pollution in your community, and so many lives are going to be saved and so many children are going to be healthier, going and looking at what the rules were coming out of EPA that would control air pollution and therefore control carbon at the same time. We were trying, and this is to Doug's point, climate's a hard issue, less so now because people are faced with the consequences, but it was a very hard issue for people to, kind of rally around because it seemed future, which it wasn't, and it seemed, on a planetary scale, which it wasn't because it was immediate. So we were working hard to try, as the administration was, what are the issues that are going to reflect on people's lives that we can talk about that have a co-benefit? Guess what? There's a climate benefit too, but maybe we're not leading with climate because that's not what the public is going to be responding to. So, things shifted. I think they did. I don't know if
yes, absolutely.
You two would agree, but
completely agree with everything.
Yeah.
Every comma, every syllable, I agree with that.
Well, how nice is that?
So, it's an interesting arc of our discussion so far. Just in a minute, we're going to start taking questions, Q&A. But, at least if I sort of, to summarize just a little bit, in 2009, there's hope and there's possibilities, but there are also limitations. Limitations on communications, limitations of politics, limitations in getting international agreements, and there's certain things that shift. Things like relationships between President Obama and other leaders. Things like what you just said, fracking. So suddenly people see the environment as something that's close rather than far. Changes in the media landscape and communications that enable you to do things. Like I assume that in 2009, nobody's thinking of President Obama going to Alaska with a celebrity,
right.
But once social media, stuff like that happens, President Biden goes on Parks and Rec, lots of things have happened, so the world is a little bit different. And Doug is sort of talking about like this kind of larger world of environmental policy making around monuments, open spaces, preservation that often escapes the attention of the media and the public at large. So it's been an interesting arc that we've described in this discussion. I think we've got just a little bit of time for Q&A to round this out. Peter, you could help me with the format. Are we going to have people come? It looks like we have a microphone here and a microphone there. We'll take questions in the order that people line up at the mics. Yeah, we should introduce ourselves or reintroduce ourselves. Hi, I'm Kenneth Mack. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School, and I'm the moderator.
I'm Todd Stern. I was the president's special envoy for climate change, so I ran the international negotiating process.
Frances Beinecke, I was the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council during the Obama administration.
Shayla Murray, I was a Obama administration official.
Douglas Brinkley, environmental presidential historian, Rice University.
Okay, questions, brief questions, responses from the audience. We'll take them in the order that people come to the microphone, please. And if you could briefly identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Saskia DeCaries, and I work at Columbia. I'm curious to know, during the Obama administration and also now, how much attention was paid to education of children. Columbia produced this great book called The Miseducation, How Climate is Taught, and it really does break down by party lines whether climate is taught as real, as climate issues as real, or as a suggestion. And it was really interesting to read what some of the teachers, how they struggle to teach it, particularly science teachers, because they're mandated to say, it is a suggestion when they know it's not. So I'm just curious, how much attention was paid to that? Because you guys talked about going into people's homes and, using social media. I'm just curious, was that a thought process? Is that something you may have done differently, seeing where we are now?
Well, I'm just, what you just triggered one thought I had. The president was, his key advisors on the environment were his daughters. And I'm not saying that to be facetious. They were very into saving of endangered species, animal life. It's one reason, as ex-president, connected to World Wildlife Fund building, and meaning his kids kept reminding him about the planet that they're going to be inheriting. And he has said this in many different, and I think he used his daughter's understanding that for a younger generation, the environment and climate is the issue, which today Generation Z is living with, right? That all the constituents are, it's it's mass concern about this, and I think his daughters expressed it, and he saw that linkage and connection. And there were little kids in the White House, but they're talking about polar bears floating, commercials that NRDC or others can take that show people what's happening, the plight of vanishing species and the like, and so I think that would be my contribution to it. I'll let somebody else talk more about the schools or education outreach.
I'm just not really familiar with that aspect because we were working very much on the policy side. And, as I said at the beginning, we were so focused on the policy side that we weren't really focused on what does it take to kind of reach out to the broader public. So the fact that we really weren't paying attention to that is probably a good sign of where we need to get better. We focused getting better on creating more political muscle, because one thing I didn't say, but you just cannot overestimate the power of the oil and gas industry in this issue overall, continuing, not only in the United States, throughout the world. I mean, they so own this issue, they're so powerful. What it takes to knock them off their pedestal is, you know, it's a Herculean effort, basically. And, you know, they do it sometimes under the radar, but, you know, they have muscle that is just, you know, hard to exaggerate how powerful it is.
Can I
That's
make
still true.
one comment so as to not leave everybody gloomy and doomy? I don't disagree with anything Francis said, but it is also true that the state of technological improvement and technological innovation is absolutely extraordinary. Over the last 10 years, the price of solar, wind, batteries, et cetera, have gone, the curves look like this. It's absolutely plummeting in cost, absolutely soaring in penetration. The incumbent power of fossil fuels is absolutely a reality, but it is likely, there are many good analysts who think that fossil fuels have peaked now, and they will be going progressively down because the value proposition of clean energy is so much greater. It's now cheaper to do wind or solar than coal in 96% of the world. It is cheaper in about 70% of the world to build a new solar installation or a new wind farm than to just run an existing coal plant. And this is happening, it's accelerating, and we are going to see fight to the death from fossil fuel industries. But I have no doubt that the challenger side of this battle is going to win. The question is whether we can win fast enough.
Fast enough, that's the issue.
Because this is always a race against time.
Right.
But the fossil fuel industry is not omnipotent. They are going to fight for to keep the privileges that they've had, but they are actually starting to lose against clean energy.
Well, on that point, and this just to emphasize something that Todd said at the beginning, the Recovery Act unleashed a lot of that technology, which is now being realized.
Yeah.
So, you know, the Recovery Act supported Elon Musk in creating the Tesla. Now, you know, the Tesla is like the example of where the automobile industry is going. He never actually talks about getting money from the Recovery Act, but he did. Yeah. And, you know, that's something just to keep in mind. And also the price of renewables coming down, I mean, that started at that time. And it's, you know, it's cheaper to build renewables than it is to do fossil fuels. So, yeah, it's a dying industry, but they're going out fighting.
No, that's
what can
right.
I say, Todd?
Absolutely right.
A great point. I don't feel we answered your very good question well enough on kids, and I'm hesitated it when you threw it, but I would like to part one little thing. I just learned, I wrote a book on the Silent Spring Revolution about the 1960s and 70s, and Earth Day generation, and Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all of this going on. And the one thing I learned from doing that research that can be imparted on kids today is have fun saving the planet. The doom and gloom creates problem. David Brower used to say that. I first started reading this have fun doing it seemed a little frivolous, but I started realizing that get out there and get engaged and have fun saving the planet. And if you're getting really fearful of the doom, and it's hurting you psychologically and creating depression, don't let it. Stay upbeat, stay positive. I know it's and join something. Join a friend of a national monument, or join a seashore cleanup, or join NRDC, or join, but be active in it, because I do think when the technological issues there, that at some point it's going to meet. We're going to get a wave on this where an enlightened public meets technology and cost efficiency, and we will be somewhere. And it may not be tomorrow, it may not be the next day, but you need to become conservation/preservation/environmentally active, even if it's just an hour a week in your local, park program, because eventually all those emails will connect, and it'll become a real movement.
I think we have another question.
My name is Claudia Hernandez, and I'm with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I would like to know what you think philanthropy, what can we do better on climate change moving forward? Thank you.
Well, I can take a shot at a little bit of that anyway. I think that the biggest issue at some level in international climate is the issue of finance, and the failure to provide enough climate-related finance, clean energy-related finance to particularly developing countries and poor countries also creates a very bad kind of dynamic within the ongoing climate discussions. I think there's been a lot of focus in the last year and a half in ways to use the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks around the world to much more effectively use the resources they have, to partly use the resources they have to be able to bring in the private sector in what people call de-risking the private sector's investment, because there's tons more money on the private investment side than there is in all the governments put together. So I think that those are things that can be powerful and important. I mean, others may have comments.
On a very specific point, first of all, I completely agree. The issue of finance is the critical issue. The emitting nations created the problem. The developing nations are experiencing the result, and they didn't create it, and they don't have the resources to manage it, and we're not stepping up to the plate. So there has to be a huge increase in finance and the mechanisms to provide it, both public sector, private sector. Just in the immediate of advancing the United States right now, making sure that the Inflation Reduction Act actually gets implemented on the ground, and that the stories around the country of the transformation that's being created are told, and because there's an echo chamber of, this is government graft, too much money is going to be terrible, et cetera, et cetera. We have to combat that with a narrative that's really showing how the money is getting spent, how we're making the clean energy transition, what jobs are getting created as a result, and make sure that that happens in a geographically spread way, that it's not just restricted to the coast or the places that already are on the bandwagon on climate change, because the money is actually getting spent all over the country, and people need to know it and see that what's happening in their community is coming from this opportunity, and that it has a positive benefit.
One of the biggest challenges we faced early on was this whole Solyndra effect, right? Where the one thing that people remember from that enormous pile of bets on the future, right, that paid out, like Tesla, is that ridiculous Solyndra debacle, and yet that is the threat.
To Shiloh's point, they're looking for Solyndra. The Republican Congress is looking every day to find the next Solyndra. They've made that, it's sort of like, Mitch McConnell saying, we're not going to let President Obama win the next election, or whatever he said. We're going to make sure he has no victories. That's exactly what they're doing for the Inflation Reduction Act. It's very focused, it's very intentional, and there has to be a robust narrative on the other side, and not wait for that to happen. It's sort of a crucial piece of keeping the advancement going. And to what Doug said at the beginning, there is now tremendous data on actually the green jobs creation. When we were talking about it in 2009, we hoped it was true, but we didn't have anything to show for it. But now, actually, there is tons of evidence and a lot of data, and making those stories known is it's a critical part. It's not just the policy, the narrative's crucial.
I want to just come back for 1 second, because I didn't completely finish answering your question, I think, because you were asking about what philanthropies can do. And I think philanthropies, big ones in particular, Rockefeller is actually active in this regard. But Bezos and others big philanthropy can put in some of the de-risking finance to get projects going. Obviously, they can't do it all over the world. They don't have that much money, but they can do that in a number of cases and show that a particular form of financial support can work in this project when the philanthropies can put up this amount of upfront money to get things going. And then if you see the project worked here, then we can replicate it here, there, and in other places. So I think that there really is an important place for particularly big philanthropies to assist on the finance side. And again, Rockefeller has really been a leader here.
Yeah, and always more money.
Well, always more money. You know, just as an aside, as a historian, but the Rockefeller family, what they did for conservation in the 20th century, where they were the leaders, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Lawrence Rockefeller, we wouldn't have, nobody fought harder for redwoods and, you know, and so it's a natural progression for Rockefeller, I think, to be one of the philanthropic leaders on, as you know, on anything to do with earth stewardship. It's right in the wheelhouse of all the great work you guys have done for decades now.
To get us together. Of course, RBF, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, has been one of the leaders on climate change and tried to push that agenda. And I think one of our challenges is sitting us together at the table. You know, so my question specifically is, what can we do better? You see, from where you stand. You know, I know that changing narrative is really, really important. As long as we put our heads together and agree on it, on the philanthropy side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we're actually at time, but I think that's actually a really powerful concluding thought. One of the themes of our panel today is really about how much environmental and climate policy was a confluence of different actors, different contexts, learning from past mistakes as it evolved over the course of the 8 years of the Obama administration. And I'd be remiss if I didn't remind everybody at the end of this that this is a session connected to the rollout of the Columbia University Obama Presidency Oral History Project. Interviews with about 400 individuals, of which we have 17 public at the moment on the website as we speak. That can be accessed in video and transcript form. And what we've heard here is just a little snippet of the first 17 interviews that have been released, and there will be many more, and many more discussions like this one. But for the moment, I should thank our panelists for being so kind to come.
Very fun. Very fun.
I also thank everybody. It's really been a special afternoon. The next event is the reception, and you are directed to go out that door behind me, and food and drinks and all of the people here will be there to continue the conversation. Thanks so much, Ken, Todd, Francis, Shayla, and Doug. We really appreciate it.